Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. Climate Responsive Architecture. Chapter 6, A New Global Urban Vernacular. Let's pause for a moment and ask, how can vernacular buildings, those timeless local structures, actually guide the way we design for today's cities? In their raw form, they cannot possibly meet all the complex demands of our urban lives. They were never intended for metros, skyscrapers, or digital networks. They were built for slower rhythms, smaller communities, and specific environments. And yet, despite their modest origins, they hold a kind of wisdom that we desperately need, especially in a century marked by climate crisis and rapid urban growth. If you like, you could call them the ancestors of sustainable design. A bit less glamorous than a glass tower, perhaps, but far more reliable in the long run. The truth is that vernacular architecture is not about copying. It is not about nostalgia or about rebuilding a mud brick hut in the middle of a 21st century metropolis to make ourselves feel authentic. Instead, the point is to treat these traditional forms as a living library, a collection of lessons carved out by necessity, climate, and the social fabric of communities. Vernacular architecture is not frozen in time, it is a source of guidance. If we look at it only as a static style to imitate, we miss the essence. But if we approach it as a body of knowledge, then it becomes a starting point for new possibilities. And besides, no one is asking you to swap your Wi-Fi for a donkey cart. The aim is balance, not regression. When architects and planners attempt to replicate vernacular structures too literally, the results often feel out of place. A courtyard transplanted into a dense megacity block may not function as intended. A pitched roof, once perfect for heavy rainfall in one region, may look awkward and perform poorly in another climate. Copying produces mimicry, but rarely produces genuine sustainability. That is why we must go deeper. We must ask not what vernacular looked like, but why it looked that way. Why were walls thick in some places and thin in others? Why did some communities build houses on stilts, while others buried them half underground? The answers always return to the same set of forces: climate, materials, and culture. Or put more, people did what worked, and what failed was quietly abandoned. It was natural selection, only for houses instead of species. Vernacular architecture in this sense was never decorative. It was experimental, though not in the sterile laboratory of a university campus, but in the messy reality of lived experience. Communities tested forms over centuries. If a structure collapsed, it was rebuilt differently. If a roof leaked, it was redesigned. If a material crumbled, another was chosen. These were not random acts, but careful collective experiments across generations. In this way, vernacular buildings were humanity's earliest laboratories of resilience. They carry a quiet dignity because they were born not of ego but of necessity, and they still hold lessons for us if we are willing to read them. Though admittedly they are written in mud brick, timber, and stone rather than in neat footnotes. Of course, we must also acknowledge the tension of modern needs. Vernacular buildings in their original forms cannot address the requirements of airports, hospitals, or data centers. They were not designed for globalized societies or digital economies. And yet, ignoring vernacular wisdom entirely has created equally troubling outcomes. Glass towers now rise in deserts, shimmering icons that consume vast amounts of energy to remain habitable. Suburban sprawl consumes ecosystems, necessitating an endless reliance on cars and imported energy. In many cases, modern design does not respond to climate. It tries to overpower it, wasting resources in the process. We have been trying to outsmart the sun with air conditioning and outwit rain with concrete. But in the end, the climate usually wins. Vernacular shows us another path, one where buildings cooperate with their environments rather than fight them. So what does this mean for the future? It means that the idea of vernacular must evolve, not as a frozen image, but as a dynamic principle. A new global urban vernacular would not be about reconstructing identical mud brick houses across the world. Instead, it would be about extracting principles, shading, orientation, material efficiency, spatial logic, and embedding them into the codes and standards of today's cities. Consider natural ventilation. In traditional designs, windows were carefully positioned to capture breezes or encourage cross-flow of air. Courtyards created pressure differences that kept air circulating. These are not quaint tricks for postcard villages. They are scientifically valid strategies. Reapplied in modern housing blocks, they can drastically reduce cooling needs. In other words, vernacular was doing passive design, long before consultants gave it a sleek new name. Material efficiency offers another clear example. Traditional builders always used what was close at hand: clay, stone, timber, and reeds. They did not have the luxury of importing steel across oceans or concrete across continents. This created a kind of material honesty, a forced sustainability that contemporary systems often ignore. In our age of global trade, we could reinterpret this lesson as sourcing regionally, lowering carbon footprints, and reviving forgotten craft knowledge. We do not have to pretend that bamboo scaffolding will replace high-performance steel, but we can learn from the frugality and intelligence with which materials were chosen. In short, the new global urban vernacular is not a style, it is a framework. It is about learning from the past, applying it in the present, and adapting it intelligently for the future. And why emphasize this now in the 21st century? Because we are facing a crisis unprecedented in scale. Rising seas threaten coastal cities, heat waves strain energy grids and make urban life unbearable. Air pollution suffocates entire populations. Energy consumption spirals out of control. If architecture continues to ignore climate, it will only deepen these problems. But if we recenter architecture on climate, as vernacular always did, we may yet discover pathways toward resilience. To put it less politely, the house is literally on fire, and the old ways might offer us a bucket of water. This episode marks the beginning of the final arc of our season. In the chapters that follow, we will move deeper into vernacular as knowledge transfer, into frameworks for global adaptation, into the roles of narrative and education, and finally into the ways tradition can meet technology. The journey will take us from humble village huts to futuristic AI-assisted design, from clay walls to smart cities, from ancient wisdom to digital innovation. The question is not whether vernacular has a place in the future. The real question is whether the future can exist without vernacular. And perhaps the answer lies in the fact that the future of sustainable cities has been with us all along, in shaded courtyards, in thick earthen walls, on raised platforms, and in profound yet straightforward forms of human adaptation. Or to put it another way, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to remember why our ancestors were clever enough to invent the roof. This is the end of the Climate Responsive Architecture, Chapter 6, A New Global Urban Vernacular. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.